So you will notice we're going to do something with our Theory Thursday. It's a little bit different, and I only say that because we've got a couple theories to cover over. So the model that I have in front of you actually starts everything off in terms of uh, what's called agenda setting theory. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but we'll also talk about a little bit about media framing and media priming. So get into the emphasis of what these things are, how they bring themselves to life within the context of media, how they changed over the years, as well as how can we look at this in terms of a persuasive theory? Because by itself, agenda setting and framing aren't necessarily what you would call persuasion theories, although there's a lot of persuasive elements within them. So this is typically a mass comm theory. So we've really kind of bridged the gaps between the breadth of communication from intrapersonal, which is what we've been talking about for the most part, to mass communication. Now, mass communication has grown significantly over the years in terms of how we've defined it, how we've conceptualized it, how we operationalize it. There's a lot of things that go in with mass comm that aren't what they used to be when it was first being studied. And to give you a good example of that, one of the first theories that talks about mass communication was a theory called hypodermic needle model, or it was also known as the magic bullet model. These were theories, or well, a theory that kind of had two names. That was around the time of the 1930s, around it kind of coined through Nazi Germany, for instance, in terms of some of the propagated messages that were being delivered. And so what it really kind of got into was that we are susceptible, we are injected with media. And because of that, we are prone to whatever it delivers to us. So, we're basically a helpless society overlooked by what would be essentially a tyrannical media that's, again, injecting its messages, its ideals into us. And that was very short-lived in terms of a theory that, although still talked about today, the limited effects model came in right after it and basically said, well, no, people can think for themselves. It's not just the mass media in this case, which I hate that term, by the way, mass media. There's really no the media. You can talk about mainstream media, local media, etc., but we'll get more into that later. But the thing that is really referenced here when it comes to the limited effects model, for instance, is that, again, we all have our thought process with us. And, it's one of those things that when we're injected with this idea of mass communication from a source, we can objectively say, look into what's being said, and then critically evaluate what's being said, based on our experiences, based on what we're seeing, so forth. So that's kind of the building blocks of it. Now, granted, there's a lot of media theories, uses and gratification, cultivation theory. There's a lot of different things that we could look at. But within this, I want to talk about what agenda setting is. Now, I've mentioned this before in a previous lecture that agenda setting really looked at how messages over time tend to resonate with their audience. So, mass media outlets will present a topic that they find within their own agenda. So something they find very important. And so they publicize what it is that they find important. So when you are presenting this information, you're basically saying, of all the stories that could be covered today, this is what I deem is very important. And when this theory was first conceptualized, the public opinion and what was delivered in mass communication was actually extremely similar. If you took the top 5 news stories, like I said, I may have mentioned this. If you take the top 5 news stories in terms of what mass media outlets produce versus court of public opinion, they would almost always match, like 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5 in terms of importance. Nowadays, you see that it's probably only 2 of 5, maybe 3 of 5 at best in terms of what is the most important news story as of right now. You could probably make an argument in terms of what's the most important news story for you right now. In terms of, you could say something like the school walkouts within the Parkland shooting. You could probably mention the conflict within North Korea. There's probably a plethora of things that you could pull from. But then there's also things that you would say, I find this important or I don't find this important, even though the media agenda is publicizing this. So we look at this again in kind of an older sense when we're talking about a media agenda. So what happens here is that there are what's called gatekeepers. And gatekeepers can be easily seen as, if you were looking at a newspaper, for instance, an editor. So if you're a columnist or have ever worked as a columnist, you will always have an editor who looks at your material, makes sure that it is in line with the brand image that the newspaper is trying to convey, unless you're opinion editorial. You can get away with a little bit more in that regard. But, make sure that you are on the same page with the mission of the newspaper. Make sure that you're presenting something that's interesting, maybe even a little controversial, but not so controversial, whatever it may be. So these gatekeepers look at this information and say, this is what's going to go in the air. This is what's not going in the air. This is what's important. This is what's not important. And going through this, I taught a media writing class back when I was at North Dakota State, and something that was talked about was, if you're local, national, or regional, what stories would you want to convey? Would you want to convey a high school championship of a volleyball tournament on national news? Well, probably not. You probably save it for local. So this is where that media agenda comes into play here, in terms of what's being promoted here. So the media agenda in this particular area goes into what is the public agenda. So this will go a little bit more into priming, per se, because this actually looks into the persuasion aspect of what makes it, of what makes this information viable, what makes this information persuasive in this case, in terms of what goes from a media outlet to a public outlet in this case. And again, the major thing is who sets the agenda. So this is a major consideration when it comes into the areas of newly formed research within agenda setting, because initially agenda setting was a mass media outlet delivers a message, the public receives it, it's filtered by a gatekeeper in terms of what's important. The public then looks into this area of importance, as you see down here, as well as their own personal experience. That those things all resonate with what's being delivered by the media agenda, and thus could go into policy in this case. So, in this particular area, we see that the model kind of looks in a cyclical fashion here. So, media to public agenda to policy agenda, where the policy agenda actually has this like feedback loop, and to where when policy hits, that's when the media sets the agenda again. Now, this is a good model to reference by when you look at agenda setting. However, within new research of agenda setting, this is kind of getting to my point, was, do you set the agenda at all? Because it used to be, think of it in the way of public relations, for instance. So if a issue were to happen or a crisis were to happen, what a PR agency would do was they would send this information to the journalist, and then the journalist would publish it. Whereas nowadays, I can skip the middle person and say, I'm going to publish this information by myself. So if I'm a PR agent, representative, and it doesn't even have to be crisis or issue. It can just be, I'm launching a new product and I want people to take notice. Well, I can just put it on my Facebook account. I don't need a journalist to be able to do this for me. And so this is the kind of case where things have changed over the years, where organizations can produce their own messages, where you can produce your own message. And this is an area where we're starting to see a little bit of a drastic change within who's setting the agenda. Is it you or is it mass media outlets? And in many cases, it's both. It's usually both in terms of what's being set up here. So afterwards, so let's dig a little bit deeper. So we have this area of agenda setting theory, and so we talk about media agenda. The main premise that we have to think about when we're thinking about agenda setting is the area of what is important, like what story is important. However, if you've ever, again, covered a news event, had a deadline within, like if you've ever written up a script for a news story that you had to present at 6 o'clock, so you interview somebody at 1 o'clock, you've got to edit at 3, and then you present your information to the station. Well, here's the thing. If we're talking about the kind of classic idea of what is news, so the 1 hour program of from start to finish, your 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock prime time news, it's very difficult to say how much information can I put in? What do I deem important and how much information can I put in? So this is where we get into what's called media framing. And media framing actually takes a look at the elements within the story. So we know that it's important. So again, let's say that you're producing some information. You go into saying, this is what I'm setting my agenda to say that this is the most important message. I'm informing people that this is the most important message. Ergo, I'm kind of persuading them that this is what you should be taking a look at. But within that story, we've got to say, what is it that I want you to take a look in? So you could look at this from multiple perspectives. Let's talk about, we could talk about that news story within the Parkland shooting of terms of seeing the sides of the story in terms of, do you think it's a wise thing for students to march? Do you think there should be more gun control? Do you think that these laws should be left alone? Looking at Second Amendment rights. So these may be areas where news outlets could take a look at all of these elements combined. And so this is where a lot of people actually kind of go in and say this is a media bias, if you will. So a media outlet is very conservative or very liberal in this case. And where that typically stems from in terms of the notion of media framing is they're saying, what are they not talking about? So media framing in this case talks about selection, emphasis, exclusion, those particular areas. So we select things, we emphasize them, we elaborate. That was the other one I was thinking of. We elaborate on certain things and we exclude some things. So there may be some areas that because of time or because of the message within the station that we do not talk about when we're presenting this message. So again, we may avoid the other side altogether just to get our message across. Now that's typically not done. Even in some of your more conservative or more liberal stations, there is the other side that's approached. It's probably just not nearly as prominent as others. And we also have to think about, and this is where framing can get into some of your persuasion elements as well, is what's going through your mind when you're watching this. There's a great theory called selective attention, within the elements of mass communication that says, how much do you actually pay attention to the message that disagrees with you? How much do you seek out a message that disagrees with you? Most of us look at messages that we agree with, that we'll support. So right now we're dealing with March Madness, basketball tournaments coming up, and my beloved Hokies are playing tonight. And there are a lot of correspondents that say, Alabama is going to beat Virginia Tech, which I hope they don't, but it is something to think about. And do I pay attention to those messages when they say, the Hokies don't have a chance? If someone says that, I might be the person that says, turn the TV off. Whereas, again, if we deal with a political message, for instance, if there's something that communicates something the opposite side of where I'm sitting, we may get into some of that dual processing of do I strengthen my area of rejection versus moving in the opposite direction. So this is the area of framing. And framing, again, covers these small instances within the major story itself. Whatever that major story may be, what is being said, what isn't being said, And that's important because you think about we think about it in the way that we talk about persuasion. You may sit there and say to somebody, "It's not what you said; it's what you didn't say." It can be just as important in this case. Whereas priming theory looks at media images that stimulate thoughts through the minds of particular audience members. So we're taking this one step further, and this is actually why, although granted these differences are small, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of what makes some elements of framing versus second level agenda setting different. But there are some scholars that say instead of agenda setting, framing, priming, we're going to do agenda setting, first level, second level, third level. Third level, or priming, in this case, looks at effects. And again, looks at these media images, looking at related thoughts within the minds of our audience members. And how does it relate? So when you're watching something, again, how do these messages resonate with you? Do you recall them? Do you have an opinion based on what's being said? Or are you strictly apathetic to? So, this is where the effects come in. This is where the notion of where a lot of people talk about video games, for instance, and how there is this, there are studies that kind of look at the correlation between violent video games and violent behavior versus a correlation that the fact that there is no correlation between violent games and violent behavior. But there is the area of priming in terms of what's being said versus how we're interpreting it. And it's very important to consider when we're looking at this information. So think about these in the sense of what's important, what's being said within that important information, and how are you resonating with this information. So again, this can be a myriad of things in terms of our nodes, if you will, stores as nodes in a network within our brain, and the semantic paths that come with them. And how do we activate these nodes, which may be filtering out a message here or there, or an interpretive frame to further information processing or judgment formation. So again, it may be something within selective attention that we want to turn off or we want to keep paying attention to. This is what I've mentioned before in terms of if you're very interested in the topic, you're always more likely to pay attention to it. The problem is how, depending on where you are in terms of the span of I'm going to accept something or reject something, how much am I paying attention to what's being said? And because of that, what is my opinion towards it? So I might have a very strong opinion. So you may give me a persuasive message within priming, or in this case, a framing message, and I might prime it in such a way that I'm interested in what's being said, but I'm going to reject it because I disagree with what's being said. And it's interesting how the area of things like science, for instance, really thrives under these mistakes and really thrives under these elements of combatants in terms of disagreement to get the biggest strength of argument. Got a good example of met with my dissertation advisor in Winston-Salem on Sunday, and I talked with her husband, who is an economist, and he's currently doing a bit of a research fellowship or a teaching fellowship at Wake Forest, and talking about the area of minimum wage and whether we should increase it or not. And it was interesting because the argument that was made was actually something that a Wake Forest professor sat there and said, you know what, I actually disagree with this. But you make a sound argument, the information is there, there's a lot of sources to back up what you're saying, so I really want to hear more about what's being said. And so that, again, my dissertation chair's husband is going to present this information to Wake Forest, which is pretty cool. Again, especially in the fact that this professor disagreed with what's being said. But if the foundation of the argument's there, these are all things that we should probably be thinking about when we're looking at this information in terms of what's being said versus how we interpret it. So that's it for today with our little Theory Thursday. If you got any questions about it, please let me know. Really cool theories. This is actually, again, media framing is what I actually wrote my master's thesis on once upon a time. But again, if you're interested in this kind of thing, please let me know. And hope you all have a wonderful day. I'll talk to you all tomorrow. All right, thanks.